stories about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. On today's episode, I would like to talk about language, specifically the nature of the language that we use when introducing new ideas, new concepts, new policies, new practices, new something to the world, and specifically in the space of the environment or policy and planning, or these topics that deal with the complexity of the world as a whole. This actually isn't a bad surrogate for the fact that I'm producing this bioretention in the real world training at the moment, because one of the things about it is, sure, I'm teaching something, but there's also so much that we don't know about bioretention systems. So how do we frame up the language appropriately to be able to teach what we do know while also admitting that there's a lot that we don't know? Anyhow, this episode is inspired because my good friend Ben Penaluric just gave me a phone call, and Ben was asking me some questions about the history of where stormwater treatment objectives came from. And that discussion quickly evolved into the pros and cons of those objectives, and where they currently have weaknesses, but what we knew at the time that they were set, and into this discussion of how do you set policy when you don't know everything about the topic or situation that you're setting policy for. Whenever we're talking about a topic, we should, in the complexity of the world, we should be able to know the fact that whenever we're setting policies or initiatives or whatever it is, that we're working in a space where we might know many things, but we don't know everything. And that is essentially a logical truth, because the world is so complex that it's impossible to know everything, but we can know many things if we put in the work to know it. But if you don't know everything, then there's a really good chance that the policies that you're creating are ultimately going to show up to be really problematic. And this is certainly a case in the stormwater industry, where current stormwater treatment design objectives, great though they have been, getting us to start doing lots of stormwater treatment and driving investment in this space. The reality is they're fundamentally really problematic and have lots and lots and lots of flaws with them. And so you can quickly end up in this discussion about, one way to take this is, well, if we introduce, or if we have such a complex environment, should we have introduced stormwater treatment objectives? If we knew that we didn't know everything about it, should we have introduced them? And I would argue yes. I would argue that when you're working in a space where you need to introduce some policy about a topic on which you know something, but definitely not everything, and therefore the policy that you're introducing is probably going to have some flaws in it, you've really got three choices. You can really either do nothing and not introduce anything, which is essentially going, oh my goodness, we don't know it all, so we're going to do nothing. That's essentially paralysis by analysis. On the other end of things, you can introduce your policy and essentially swear black and blue that it's the bee's knees, the gold standard, so to speak, and essentially not admit that there are any possible flaws with it. Or there's a middle line to tread, and I'm going to make the argument in this video that the middle line is the only appropriate line to take, and I'll give at least one good reason as to why that's the case. But first, the problems with the others. The problem with doing nothing should be fairly self-explanatory. If you're trying to introduce policy in the first place, there's clearly a problem you're trying to solve. So doing nothing means the problem's going to persist. So in the case of stormwater treatment objectives, people saw stormwater pollution as a problem, but if you recognise that we don't know everything about stormwater pollution and stormwater treatment, and therefore decide to do nothing, then the stormwater pollution is still a problem. So that's a pretty easy one to dispel. At the other end of the spectrum is the situation where you recognise that you don't know everything, but you've got a policy that you want to get through, but you don't admit, in the language that you use up front, you don't admit that there's any potential flaws to it. This is essentially what happens in politics all the time. Politicians introduce a new idea, but have you ever heard a politician say, here's my new economic reform. It's not perfect, but it's the best of the options we have available. That never happens, right? And this is all about, the problem with this is that it means that in the long term, When the problems become apparent, and they will become apparent because the world's really complex and our solution isn't perfect to it, our knowledge isn't perfect. When the problems become apparent, if you've 5 years ago been up on a public stage being like, nope, this is the perfect solution, this is absolutely the right way to go, this is the only good, this is it, this is thumbs up. If that's been you, suddenly you're in a really problematic spot from 2 points of view, one of which is from cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is the feeling of unease that you get when your actions don't match up with what you know to be true. So for example, it's that unease that you get if you, for example, want to lose weight but are snacking on a chocolate bar at the same time, and you know that the chocolate bar is not the thing that you should be snacking on at that point in time, right? Or it's cognitive dissonance is the feeling of, it's that feeling of unease when your actions and your thoughts don't match up together. So cognitive dissonance plays out in this. If you've been the politician who stood up with a policy that was, even if it was the best possible policy at the time, but had some flaws, and you stood up and said, this is it, this is absolutely the solution, there's no problems with this at all, this is, The problem is that 5 years down the track, when the problems are apparent, you are going to be facing dissonance because the real world is saying there were problems here, but your previous speech, your previous action has been, it was perfect, it was great, right? So your knowledge is now, it's imperfect, but your previous actions were, it was great, it was great, it was great. So you have dissonance. And the problem with dissonance is that when we face it, the easy route out in the short term is to dig our feet in and support our already entrenched position. So if it was the politician there and their policy, then the easy, at least in the short term, route is not to say, oh, actually I was wrong 5 years ago, but it's just to dig in and say, no, the policy was the best ever. It was the only policy that could possibly have worked. It's great, it's perfect, it's amazing. That's actually the way we dig in. And we see this all the time in politics. This is why you end up with these big divides in politics, right? Because each side digs into their entrenched position to support it. Now, there is a solution that you can, when you face dissonance, admit and go, I was wrong. And it feels painful in the short term, but it's actually way easier in the long term because it takes that burden off your mind. It gets rid of the dissonance. The first option where you dig in creates more and more and more and more dissonance over time and locks it in and makes it even harder to change your opinion later. But the option of admitting that you were wrong and changing takes more effort in that moment of time, but then solves the problem because you've admitted that you were wrong. So when we're in this policy space, we have that particular problem. The other problem here is public shame. So once you've been seen to say something, then it's forever on the public record, and other people can pull you up on that. So coming back to our options, I've said at one end of the spectrum is you have an issue that you need to solve, but you recognize that you don't have the perfect answer, so you do nothing. So it's paralysis by analysis. Then at the other end is I have a solution, it's not perfect, but I need to get it done, so I'm just going to go all in on it and go, it's the most amazing, it's the only possible thing, and speak about it in absolute certainties with no admission that it could be flawed. But that generates dissonance and ultimately prevents you in the long term from changing it. Because when it does become apparent that it's flawed and a change is required, you're going to feel all this dissonance, you're going to have this potential shame coming in from external parties who are like, hey, this is all wrong and you said this, this, and this. So that's not good either because it locks you in to that current entrenched pattern. And so what Ben and I ended up talking about on the phone is that the only real appropriate solution in this space is the middle ground. And it's the middle ground that says, look, we have a real problem here. We do not know anything, but it's not appropriate to do nothing because doing nothing will let the problem persist. We do know some things, not enough to get this right first time, but if we have a crack, we'll learn more things and have more of a chance of getting it right next time. So the completely right approach to this is to just openly and upfront admit, hey, look, it's not perfect, but it's unreasonable to expect it to be perfect. We just have to go in with the best ideas and the best opportunities. And then where this is the sweet spot is the fact that it allows us to act in the short term. It allows us to go, look, here's our best crack at this. But it also means that when it goes wrong, we can come back and be like, okay, look, we knew this wasn't going to be perfect, so it's okay, we're comfortable to adapt and to change. There's no dissonance at this point. There's none of this like, oh my goodness, I said this was perfect and now it's not. Oh my God, what happened? There's none of that happens on the middle ground that we need to talk about things. And sometimes I think in the stormwater industry, we might have got this a little bit wrong, or I see this playing out a little bit, particularly with respect to stormwater objectives, because the current objectives were introduced, and I feel like, and obviously I'm thinking a fair way back in time, but I feel like my perception when they were introduced and I heard them being talked about and I went to presentations about them, is that they were talked about, and water sensitive urban design was talked about as this great thing, this great solution, this great solution to our urban stormwater problems. And so they were talked about with this certainty of, yes, we have the answer and here's the policy to do it. And I feel, so we've gone down this approach kind of over this end of things where we did implement policy, but we talked about it as if it was like absolutely spot on, when it wasn't. And I think we're seeing part of the problem with that now play out in our policy around stormwater space, because I see us digging in our heels a little bit as the criticisms emerge about the current practices, as the criticisms emerge about stormwater treatment objectives or about bioretention systems. We tend to end up in this kind of all or nothing situation where we end up protecting them rather than just being willing to go, hey, look, you know what? Current practice isn't perfect. Let's just try and iterate on it. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we do have to iterate. I see us being a little bit stuck too much down the, oh no, there's not a problem route of things, or the flip side, which is it's all stuffed route of things. And I think we could have fixed that a little bit if up front, when we initially introduced these objectives, we talked about them with a little bit more of the language of, look, these are our first go at doing this. They are the best option we currently have on the table, and we definitely need to do something for these reasons, but they might not work out perfectly, and that's okay because we will learn and iterate. I think if we'd adopted that language, and I could be wrong, maybe that language was used at the time and it's just not in my memory, but my memory of it is far more of this very certain language of, yep, here's the solution, here's the this, and this, and it's all going to be good. So that's my take. That is my take on the situation and some ramblings about language as we're introducing policy initiatives. I feel very strongly that, as tough as it might be, that whenever we introduce a new initiative, and hopefully you see this play out in Ideanthro videos, in these videos, because I do try and present the uncertainty in what we know. I don't know, tell me how well I do at that, to be honest. But I try and present the uncertainty in what we know so that we have a platform from which to grow and learn in the future. And I feel very strongly that's the way when we're talking about new policy ideas and practices and implementing them, we should talk about them in the language of, this is our current best attempt. Or even, it doesn't even have to be our current best attempt. It has to be, look, we had some options. Some of them were duds. There were a few potentially good ones. We don't even know which is absolutely certainly the best, but we have to try one. We picked this one for these reasons. We're going to give it a go. And if it doesn't work great, we'll try some of the others. Anything with that sort of language, although it presents less certainty up front and probably isn't appealing to our politicians, I feel in the long term is the right language. It's a growth mindset, right? It's accepting that we're not perfect right now and that we can grow and grow and grow into the future. I feel very strongly that's the right language to take for the best long-term outcomes in any public policy space. That's my thoughts on language in this space. I hope you found that interesting. I'll see you next time.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask us. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.